Destruction advanced rapidly. Fire and brimstone poured from the heavens like deadly rain. A group of 4 people ran desperately through the hills, fleeing the divine judgment consuming the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Among them was a nameless woman, known only as Lot's wife. In a moment of hesitation, she did something seemingly simple. She looked back. In that fleeting instant, her body transformed into a pillar of salt, remaining as a silent monument throughout the centuries. Why would a simple backward glance deserve such severe punishment? The biblical narrative dedicates only 17 words to this extraordinary event, leaving more questions than answers. What really happened in that crucial moment? Was it merely disobedience, or was something deeper occurring in this woman's heart? What does it truly mean to be turned into salt? And why was this specific element chosen for her transformation? This story, briefly mentioned in the book of Genesis and later recalled by Jesus centuries later, carries hidden meanings that few know. While most see only an act of disobedience punished with severity, the truth about Lot's wife reveals a perspective on choices, attachments, and consequences that remains deeply relevant today. What really motivated that fatal look? The answer to this question contains surprising lessons about human nature that few have fully understood. The story takes place around 1900 BC in a region we now know as the Dead Sea in the Middle East. Imagine a lush, fertile valley, as green as a garden cut through by the Jordan River. Ancient texts describe this area as resembling the garden of the Lord, a comparison to Eden itself. It was a land of extraordinary abundance where agriculture thrived and wealth flowed easily. In this luxuriant valley stood the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, prosperous urban centers that attracted merchants and travelers from throughout the region. These were walled cities with open squares, bustling marketplaces, and impressive buildings. To a person of that era, these cities represented the height of civilization and comfort. Paved streets, well-built houses, abundance of food and water, impressive luxuries in a world where most lived in tents and struggled for daily survival. Lot's wife was not a simple nomad. She lived in a permanent house in the streets of Sodom, likely a comfortable residence that reflected her husband's position as a respected man who sat at the gate, an indication that Lot possibly held a position of authority in the city. She was accustomed to a life of relative comfort, with servants, flocks, and possessions. Her days were filled with the tasks of managing a prosperous household, supervising food preparation, weaving garments, managing servants, and maintaining social relationships with other influential residents. The political world of that time was fragmented into small city-states, each governed by its own king. Sodom was under the rule of King Bera, and along with 4 neighboring cities, had recently experienced a conflict with invading kings from the east. This traumatic event, where many inhabitants were temporarily taken captive, was still fresh in the collective memory of the city. Lot's wife faced a deeply personal conflict. On one hand, she was bound to her husband, who, being Abraham's nephew, maintained a certain moral distance from the depraved culture of Sodom. On the other hand, she had built her entire adult life in this city. There were her friendships, her daily routines, her belongings accumulated over the years, and possibly daughters married to local men. The narrative suggests that Lot's family had integrated significantly into urban life, despite the morally questionable practices surrounding them. The Bible describes Sodom as a society where material abundance had led to extreme selfishness and lack of consideration for the vulnerable. Behold, this was the iniquity of your sister Sodom. Pride, fullness of bread, and abundance of idleness was in her, and in her daughters. Neither did she strengthen the hand of the poor and needy, records the prophet Ezekiel. It was a culture of excess, where materialism and physical pleasure had become the supreme values. It was in this context of extreme material comfort and moral deterioration that one day 2 strangers arrived in the city, angels in human form, with an urgent message of imminent destruction. At dusk, the 2 mysterious visitors arrived at the gates of Sodom. Lot was sitting there, as was his custom, when he spotted the foreigners. Something about them caught his attention. Perhaps it was the dignity in their bearing, or the determination in their gaze. Immediately, Lot rose and insisted that the strangers accept his hospitality, protecting them from the dangers that night in Sodom posed for unknown travelers. Lot's wife received news of the visitors' arrival while finalizing preparations for the family dinner. The presence of unexpected guests meant additional work. She quickly needed to prepare more bread, gather extra provisions, and arrange accommodations for the night. Ancient texts emphasize the importance of hospitality in that culture. Refusing to help travelers was considered a serious moral failure. Still, she probably wondered why her husband continued bringing strangers home, especially in a city increasingly hostile to outsiders. The meal had barely begun when disturbing sounds came from the street. Male voices, first distant, then increasingly closer, until they transformed into shouts and violent pounding against the door of the house. A large group of men, both young and old, all the people from every quarter, demanded that the visitors be handed over for evil purposes. Lot's wife must have felt her stomach sink. It wasn't the first time the family had faced hostility from local inhabitants. Tension escalated quickly. Lot went out to try to calm the crowd, closing the door behind him. The words he exchanged with the aggressors certainly reached his wife's ears inside the house. The desperate offer Lot made to hand over his own daughters instead of the visitors reveals the extreme danger of the situation and the patriarchal mindset of that time that viewed women as property. For Lot's wife, this must have been a moment of absolute horror and perhaps even doubt about the moral integrity of her own husband. The situation could have ended in immediate tragedy if the visitors had not revealed their supernatural powers. They pulled Lot back into the house and struck the aggressors with temporary blindness, dispersing the confused crowd that groped about for the entrance. It was at this moment that the mysterious visitors revealed their true identity and mission. "We are going to destroy this place because the outcry against them has grown great before the face of the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it." The night passed in growing anxiety as Lot desperately tried to persuade his future sons-in-law about the imminent danger. They, however, thought he was joking. Lot's wife probably oscillated between fear and disbelief. Did these men really possess the power to destroy entire cities? Was the threat genuine or just exaggerated? And if it were true, how could she abandon everything she knew, possibly including married daughters who refused to believe the warning? At dawn, the angel's urgency increased. "Arise, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, lest you be consumed in the punishment of the city." Even so, Lot hesitated. The texts say that he lingered, unable to make the final decision to abandon his life in Sodom. This hesitation is crucial to understanding what would follow. It wasn't just Lot who was reluctant to leave. His wife shared this internal conflict, perhaps even more intensely. Faced with Lot's indecision, the angels acted with decisive force. They took hold of his hand, his wife's hand, and the hands of his 2 daughters, and they brought him out and set him outside the city. This language suggests almost a forced removal. The family did not leave by their own choice, but was literally pulled from their life in Sodom by the divine messengers. Once outside the city walls, the angels gave absolute final instructions. "Escape for your life. Do not look behind you nor stay anywhere in the plain. Escape to the mountains, lest you be destroyed." The order was clear, and the reason for not looking back was not explained. It required obedience based on trust. The family began their desperate flight across the plain as the sun fully rose on the horizon. Behind them, dark clouds began to form over the condemned cities. The text speaks of brimstone and fire which the Lord rained from heaven, possibly describing a natural catastrophe of extraordinary proportions, perhaps a volcanic eruption or a meteor that released flammable compounds into the atmosphere. It was during this flight that the decisive moment occurred. Lot's wife, running a few steps behind her husband, gradually slowed down. Each step away from the city represented a departure from everything familiar to her. The weight of this loss must have grown with each moment. The sounds of destruction began to echo behind them. Explosions, collapses, distant screams. Curiosity, attachment, concern for those left behind, the pain of abandoning possessions accumulated over a lifetime. All these emotions must have intensified until they became unbearable. Then, contrary to the express divine command, she stopped, she turned, she looked. The biblical text describes the result with dramatic simplicity, but his wife looked back behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. There are no details about how this extraordinary transformation occurred. Was it instantaneous or gradual, painful or painless? The text remains silent. However, the image is powerfully evocative. A human figure, frozen in the act of looking back, transformed into the mineral that preserves and that, ironically, also makes the land sterile when deposited in excess. Lot and his daughters continued their journey without her, eventually finding refuge in the mountains, where the story would take even darker turns. But the image of Lot's wife, transformed into salt for looking back, would remain as an enigmatic symbol for millennia, briefly mentioned by Jesus centuries later as a warning. Remember Lot's wife. The region where everything happened transformed drastically after the destruction. The fertile valley, once compared to the Garden of Eden, became a desolate land, dominated by the salt lake we now know as the Dead Sea, the body of water with the highest salt concentration on the planet. where no life can thrive, and where salt formations create natural sculptures that to ancient eyes could easily resemble petrified human figures. The transformation of Lot's wife into a pillar of salt is often interpreted superficially as simple punishment for disobedience. However, this reading doesn't do justice to the symbolic depth and moral complexity of the narrative. The backward glance wasn't just disobedience to an arbitrary command, but the physical manifestation of a deeper spiritual and psychological reality. In ancient Middle Eastern culture, salt possessed multiple and often contradictory meanings. On one hand, it was essential for life. It preserved food, gave flavor, served as a valuable trade item, and was used in religious rituals as a symbol of permanent covenant. On the other hand, salt in excess made the land barren, unable to produce life. This paradox of salt as both preserver and destroyer is central to understanding the symbolism of the transformation. When Lot's wife looked back, her physical body merely manifested externally what had already happened internally. She was already bound to Sodom in her heart. The text indicates that the entire family lingered when leaving the city, suggesting a deep attachment that surpassed even the instinct for self-preservation. This attachment wasn't just to material possessions, but to a lifestyle, an identity built within that society. A frequently overlooked detail is that, unlike Abraham, who lived in tents as a stranger and pilgrim in the land, Lot and his family had permanently settled in Sodom, integrated into its urban culture. Lot's wife had probably built her entire adult identity as a citizen of that city. Abandoning it meant not just leaving possessions, but giving up who she had become. Ancient rabbinic texts elaborate on this idea through various traditions. One suggests that Lot's wife had repeatedly returned to Sodom during the previous night, hiding salt in the walls of the house to have an excuse to return the next day. She couldn't imagine a life without this basic element. Salt in this interpretation represents her desire to preserve her previous lifestyle at any cost. Another tradition suggests that she looked back not out of curiosity, but out of compassion, concern for the married daughters who had remained in the city. Her transformation into salt would then represent the tears shed for those who were lost, frozen in mineral form forever. This angle deeply humanizes the character, suggesting that her sin wasn't simple disobedience, but perhaps an excessive attachment that prevented her from accepting the need to move forward. Modern archaeological analyses offer fascinating perspectives on the possible historical event behind the narrative. The Dead Sea region contains large deposits of bitumen, natural asphalt, salt, and sulfuric compounds. Some scientists suggest that an earthquake could have released these flammable materials into the atmosphere, literally creating a rain of fire and brimstone. Following such a catastrophe, anyone nearby could have been enveloped by toxic gases and subsequently covered by mineral deposits, effectively creating a human statue preserved in salt and other minerals. Perhaps the most surprising aspect of the story is how Jesus reinterpreted it centuries later. Speaking about the end times, he warned, "Remember Lot's wife." In the context of his discourse, Jesus wasn't simply warning against disobedience, but against attachment to material things in moments of spiritual crisis. "Whoever is in the field, let him not turn back to get his goods," he said, directly linking Lot's wife's experience to the human tendency to value material things above spiritual survival. This connection reveals the deeper meaning of the story. It isn't just about divine punishment, but illustrates how our attachments can literally petrify us, freeze us in a moment of time, preventing our growth and ultimately our survival. It's revealing that the only other mention of Lot's wife in ancient religious texts occurs in the apocryphal Book of Wisdom, where she is described as an unbelieving soul whose statue remains a monument of incredulity. This suggests that her backward glance wasn't just behavioral disobedience, but reflected a fundamental disbelief in the divine word. She simply didn't believe the destruction would be total, or that the command not to look was really important. Another frequently neglected element is the contrast between Lot's wife and Abraham himself. Earlier in the narrative, Abraham also observes the destruction of Sodom, but from a safe distance and as an observer separate from the city, not as someone divided in his loyalties. This contrast suggests that the problem wasn't the act of witnessing the destruction itself, but the inner orientation that motivated the look. In the natural salt formations that dot the shores of today's Dead Sea, visitors across the centuries have claimed to identify the silhouette of Lot's wife. One such formation on Mount Sodom was particularly associated with the legend. As a form of geological irony, these natural salt pillars eventually dissolve with erosion and are replaced by new formations, a reminder of the impermanence of what seems most durable. To discover more fascinating stories like this one, simply subscribe to the channel.
where we explore the deeper and often ignored layers of ancient biblical narratives, revealing meanings relevant to our contemporary dilemmas. The story of Lot's wife speaks directly to the heart of universal human experience, our difficulty in leaving the past behind. In every life, there are crucial moments when we are called to make decisive choices, to abandon toxic relationships, leave unsatisfying jobs, move to a new city, or simply renounce habits and thought patterns that no longer serve us. In these moments of transition, we often find ourselves divided, physically moving in one direction, while emotionally remaining bound to what we're leaving behind. The transformation into salt represents this state of emotional and spiritual paralysis. When we fail to completely abandon situations that we already recognize as destructive, we become like statues, preserved externally, but without inner life, incapable of growth or change. Salt preserves, but it also prevents the development of new life. How many people today are metaphorically transformed into pillars of salt, frozen in the moment of looking back at past relationships, lost opportunities, mistakes made, or unresolved traumas? The brevity with which the Bible records this story, dedicating just one sentence to the transformation of Lot's wife, contrasts dramatically with its lasting impact on human imagination. This disproportion between textual economy and symbolic richness suggests that we are confronting a fundamental truth about the human condition, expressed through an archetypal image that transcends cultures and eras. The angels instructed Lot and his family to flee to the mountains, an upward movement, symbolizing spiritual growth and elevated perspective. Lot's wife, by looking back, rejected this upward movement in favor of a horizontal gaze toward what was being left behind. This choice of orientation, upward versus backward, reflects our own daily choices about where we focus our attention and energy. Perhaps the most important question this story invites us to consider isn't why Lot's wife was turned into salt, but what are the cities in our own lives that we continue to look back at, even when we know we should move forward? What are the attachments, habits, relationships, or situations that, like Sodom, may offer temporary comfort but ultimately destroy us? And what do we need to do to avoid becoming static monuments to what we could have been? Lot's wife remains nameless in Scripture, a significant detail that allows her to function as a mirror for all of us. Her transformation into salt invites us to question what prevents us from fully following the calls to transformation in our lives. What fears, attachments, or disbelief keep us looking backward when we should be running forward? Jesus, in evoking this story centuries later, emphasized its continuing relevance. Whoever seeks to save his life will lose it, he said, echoing the paradox of the woman who, in attempting to maintain connection with her previous life, completely lost her future existence. This inversion, losing by trying to preserve, contains a profound wisdom about the nature of spiritual and emotional life. The true tragedy of Lot's wife wasn't her physical transformation into salt, but the fact that she was so internally divided that she couldn't do the one necessary thing at that moment: move forward. Her story isn't primarily about disobedience to an arbitrary command, but about the impossibility of serving two masters, of living simultaneously in two incompatible worlds. In a region where salt still permeates the landscape, making it simultaneously beautiful and barren, the image of the transformed woman remains as a silent reminder. Our reluctance to abandon what we know, even when it's destructive, can literally crystallize us, transforming us into monuments to what might have been, instead of living beings in constant growth and transformation. In the end, perhaps the deepest lesson from this ancient story isn't about divine punishment, but about the natural consequences of remaining divided in moments that demand total commitment to a new direction. As an old proverb says, a boat cannot sail in two directions at once. Lot's wife, in trying to do exactly that, found herself permanently caught between two worlds, an eternal monument to the cost of looking back when life calls us to move forward.